We've all met them. People who are absolutely certain they know what they're talking about, when it's painfully clear they don't. Maybe it's the coworker who hijacks every meeting with half-baked suggestions, or that one relative who watches a single documentary and suddenly thinks they've earned a PhD in the subject, or the internet commenter confidently arguing with professionals who spent decades in the field. What fuels this strange gap between confidence and competence? Why do the least skilled people often seem the most sure of themselves? The answer lies in a fascinating psychological phenomenon discovered in 1999. Social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger published a landmark study that changed how we think about knowledge, self-awareness, and human behavior. Their research uncovered a cognitive bias that now bears their names, the Dunning-Kruger effect. This effect explains why people with the least skill in a domain tend to wildly overestimate their abilities. Meanwhile, those with genuine expertise often underestimate theirs. As Dunning once put it, the first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Club is you don't know you're a member of the Dunning-Kruger Club. So today, we're going to dig into this strange psychological trap. We'll look at where it came from, how it works, some real-world examples, and most importantly, what we can do to spot it in ourselves. Because the big paradox of the Dunning-Kruger effect is this: the people most likely to fall into it are also the least likely to realize it. And to understand where it all began, we need to start with one of the most unusual bank robberies in American history.
In 1995, a man named MacArthur Wheeler walked into two Pittsburgh banks. It was broad daylight, no mask, no disguise, just his bare face on full display. He robbed both banks and strolled right out. Later that night, the police tracked him down easily thanks to crystal-clear surveillance footage. But here's the bizarre part. Wheeler was shocked when they showed him the video. His response? "But I wore the juice." See, Wheeler had covered his face with lemon juice because he believed it would make him invisible to security cameras. His reasoning was that lemon juice can be used as invisible ink. So he thought, if it works on paper, why not on his skin? This case caught the attention of psychologist David Dunning. He was fascinated by Wheeler's absolute confidence in a plan that was doomed to fail. Dunning started asking himself, how could someone be so incompetent and at the same time so unaware of their incompetence? That question led Dunning and his graduate student Justin Kruger to launch a systematic investigation. They designed experiments to measure not just how well people performed on certain tasks, but also how well they thought they had performed. In their landmark study, they tested participants on things like grammar, logical reasoning, and humor. After each test, participants had to estimate how they stacked up against others.
The results were eye-opening. Those who scored in the bottom quartile, the lowest 25%, dramatically overestimated their performance. On average, they believed they were performing better than 62% of their peers. In reality, they had only outperformed about 12%. Meanwhile, people who scored at the top often underestimated themselves. They thought they were performing about average, even though their results put them far above the majority. As Dunning explained, if you're incompetent, you can't know you're incompetent. The skills you need to produce a right answer are exactly the skills you need to recognize what a right answer is.
This creates what he called a double burden of incompetence. Not only do people lack the skills to perform well, they also lack the ability to recognize their own lack of skill. At its core, the Dunning-Kruger effect comes from a metacognitive failure. That's just a fancy way of saying people struggle to accurately evaluate their own knowledge and abilities. This blind spot leads to an illusion of superiority, an inflated sense of skill that's incredibly resistant to evidence. And it happens through several psychological mechanisms. First, there's the problem of unknown unknowns. When we enter a new domain, we have no idea how vast it is. We don't know what we don't know. And since we lack the knowledge to recognize expertise, we can't even see the gap in ourselves. Second, there's confirmation bias. Once we form a belief about our own abilities, we naturally pay attention to things that confirm that belief and ignore things that challenge it. A novice who thinks they're skilled will remember their successes, blame failures on external factors, and interpret mixed feedback in a way that still supports their confidence. Third, there's the general human difficulty of calibrating self-assessment. Even when we try to be objective, we often rely on faulty reference points. Without clear feedback, we default to rating ourselves as above average. Psychologists call this the illusory superiority effect. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell summed it up perfectly. The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts. This, in essence, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. The people who know the least are often the most confident, and the people who know the most are often the most cautious. But the relationship isn't as simple as less skill equals more confidence. In fact, researchers have mapped out a distinctive curve that shows how confidence and competence interact as we move from novice to expert. The journey begins at what's sometimes called Mount Stupid. This is the peak of confidence reached by beginners. They've learned just enough to feel informed, but not enough to see how much they're still missing. As Mark Twain once quipped, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." After Mount Stupid comes the Valley of Despair. This is the crash in confidence when someone learns just enough to realize how complex the field actually is. For many people, this stage is discouraging. They feel overwhelmed and sometimes give up entirely. But those who persevere eventually begin the slow climb up the slope of enlightenment, where both skill and confidence rise together through steady practice and learning. Finally, they reach what some call the plateau of sustainability, where true expertise is paired with appropriately calibrated confidence. Interestingly, experts often show a slight underconfidence. They know so much about the complexity and nuance of their field that they're always aware of what they don't know. As physicist Richard Feynman put it, "I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong." And that's the ironic twist. The more you know, the more you realize just how much you don't know.
Most of the evidence for the Dunning-Kruger effect comes from controlled lab studies. But this phenomenon isn't just a quirky finding in psychology journals. It shows up everywhere, in almost every area of life. Take the workplace, for example. You've probably seen this firsthand. The employee who's not very good at their job, but consistently thinks they're doing great. Research backs this up. In one study, an incredible 95% of managers rated themselves as performing above average compared to their peers. Obviously, the math doesn't add up, but the illusion of competence persists, creating workplace friction, resistance to feedback, and stalled professional growth. In healthcare, the stakes get even higher. Studies have shown that medical students with the lowest skill levels often overrate their clinical abilities. That overconfidence can lead to dangerous decisions, like skipping a second opinion or refusing to consult references. One study even found that the doctors most confident in their diagnoses were no more accurate than their peers, but they were less likely to double-check themselves. Politics provides another prime example. Some of the loudest voices in debates about economics, climate change, or foreign policy often come from people with the shallowest understanding. They project absolute certainty, while true experts in those same fields tend to acknowledge uncertainty, nuance, and complexity. And then there's social media, a perfect breeding ground for the Dunning-Kruger effect. Platforms give anyone the ability to broadcast opinions to a wide audience, often with the same surface-level authority as recognized experts. While this democratization of voice has benefits, it also creates what some researchers describe as an expertise crisis, a flattening of the distinction between genuine expertise and casual opinion.
As astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson put it, one of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong. This neatly captures how the Dunning-Kruger effect thrives in our digital age. But the phenomenon doesn't express itself the same way in every culture. Cultural values play a huge role in how people evaluate themselves. In Western cultures, particularly in the United States, self-promotion and confidence are highly valued. From childhood, kids are encouraged to believe in themselves and dream big. While this has its upsides, it also creates fertile ground for overestimating abilities. The American emphasis on individual achievement can unintentionally amplify the Dunning-Kruger effect. By contrast, many East Asian cultures place greater value on humility, self-criticism, and awareness of one's limitations. Studies show that Japanese students often rate themselves below average on various skills, the opposite of the above-average effect commonly found in Western participants. This cultural tendency toward modesty can actually soften the Dunning-Kruger effect, as it encourages more conservative self-assessment. Collectivist societies, where harmony and group consensus are prioritized, also tend to mitigate inflated self-assessments. In those settings, people are often more open to feedback and less likely to insist on their inflated self-image when it contradicts the group's evaluation. Confucius captured this mindset perfectly. Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. Still, no culture is immune. The fundamental challenge, not knowing what you don't know, is universal.
Now, it's important to be clear. Confidence isn't automatically a bad thing. In fact, a healthy level of confidence is crucial for motivation, persistence, and achievement. The problem arises when confidence is completely misaligned with actual ability. That's when it leads to bad decisions, arrogance, and conflict. Psychologists often talk about the sweet spot of calibrated confidence, where your self-belief matches your actual skill level. In this zone, confidence works with competence rather than against it. Research in performance psychology suggests that the best outcomes usually happen when people have moderate confidence, enough to push them forward, but not so much that they ignore mistakes or feedback. And interestingly, being slightly overconfident can actually be helpful in certain contexts. A mild positive illusion, believing you're just a little better than you really are, can boost motivation and persistence. It can help you keep going when challenges get tough. The key difference is between that kind of small, productive overconfidence and the dramatic, misguided overconfidence we see in the Dunning-Kruger effect. As psychologist Albert Bandura put it, people who have a sense of self-efficacy bounce back from failures. They approach things in terms of how to handle them rather than worrying about what can go wrong. That's a healthy kind of confidence, based on resilience and problem-solving, not denial of shortcomings. So the challenge isn't to get rid of confidence. The challenge is to align it with reality, to develop what psychologists call epistemic humility, which means recognizing both our strengths and our limits. But here's the tricky part. By its very nature, the Dunning-Kruger effect makes it hard for us to see it in ourselves. If you're caught in the trap, you're often blind to the fact that you're trapped. The first step to escaping it is to accept that everyone, no matter how smart or educated, is vulnerable to this bias. Nobody's immune. As author Robert Burton put it, the feeling of knowing is not a reliable guide to whether or not you actually know something.
So what can we do? What are some practical strategies to avoid falling into the Dunning-Kruger trap? One important approach is to seek feedback from others, especially from people who actually know more than you. Honest, expert feedback can give you an outside perspective that you can't always get from self-reflection. But this only works if you're truly open to criticism rather than instantly getting defensive. Another strategy is deliberate practice, focusing specifically on your weak areas and getting clear, immediate feedback as you improve. Without that feedback loop, practice alone can actually reinforce overconfidence. You can also work on building metacognitive awareness, essentially thinking about your own thinking. Reflect on the limits of your knowledge. Ask yourself, what don't I know? Or how might I be wrong? This habit can help you question overconfidence before it gets out of control. And perhaps the hardest but most valuable skill is learning to get comfortable with uncertainty. Our culture rewards quick, confident answers, but the truth is, thoughtful hesitation, saying, "I don't know," or "I'm not sure," is often a sign of wisdom, not weakness. The philosopher Sophocles said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." That humility is exactly what protects us from the trap of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
The digital age has taken the Dunning-Kruger effect and cranked it up to a whole new level. Thanks to the internet, anyone can look up information on virtually any topic in seconds. At first glance, that seems like a great equalizer. Knowledge that was once locked away in textbooks or university libraries is now available with a few clicks. But this easy access creates an illusion of mastery. Skimming a few articles or watching a short video can make people feel like experts, when in reality, they're only scratching the surface. Social media platforms make this even more complicated. Algorithms prioritize content that gets engagement, and the kinds of statements that get the most clicks and shares are often the bold, confident ones. Careful, nuanced, "it depends" answers rarely go viral. This means that confident but uninformed voices often rise to the top, while experts with more cautious, qualified takes get drowned out. On top of that, echo chambers and filter bubbles shield people from contradictory information. When you're only exposed to people who think the way you do, your overconfidence gets reinforced. You're less likely to encounter challenges that reveal the limits of your knowledge. There's also the issue of what some researchers call knowledge fragmentation. Online, we tend to collect scattered facts without the deeper frameworks needed to connect them meaningfully. It creates the feeling of understanding without the substance. As author Tom Nichols explains in The Death of Expertise, the internet allows us to interact with far more people than we'd meet in daily life, but it also makes us think our opinions are more valid or widely shared than they really are. The solution isn't to abandon digital information altogether, it's to approach it with greater awareness. Recognize that reading about something isn't the same as understanding it. Know the difference between access to information and comprehension of complex systems. And develop digital literacy, the ability to sort credible sources from questionable ones. Writer Maria Popova once said, "Critical thinking without hope is cynicism, but hope without critical thinking is naive." That balance is exactly what's needed to navigate today's information landscape without falling into the Dunning-Kruger trap. But the impact of this bias doesn't stop at the individual level. It has ripple effects across entire societies. In democracies, the Dunning-Kruger effect can distort elections and policy decisions. Voters with limited understanding of complex issues can feel incredibly confident in simplistic solutions. Populist movements often thrive by offering easy, black-and-white answers to problems that experts know are complicated and messy. In organizations, the effect can influence hiring and promotion. Confident but less competent candidates may overshadow truly skilled people who are more modest. Over time, this creates what some researchers call confidence cascades, a culture where displays of certainty are valued more than actual results. In science and public health, the Dunning-Kruger effect shows up as resistance to expert advice. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, countless non-experts felt fully qualified to challenge epidemiologists and public health officials armed with little more than a handful of online articles. Education isn't immune either. Parents or students with strong but misinformed opinions sometimes push back against evidence-based teaching methods, undermining teachers and creating confusion about best practices. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once observed that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the true believer, but the person who can no longer distinguish between fact and fiction. And while we may not be facing something that extreme, the erosion of epistemic authority, the ability to tell who actually knows what they're talking about, creates similar vulnerabilities in democratic societies.
So how do we address the broader implications of the Dunning-Kruger effect? On an individual level, it means practicing humility and building metacognitive habits. On an institutional level, it means rewarding not just confidence, but competence, and finding better ways to evaluate expertise. At its heart, the Dunning-Kruger effect reveals a deep paradox about human knowledge. The more we learn, the more we see the boundaries of what we don't know. As our circle of knowledge expands, so does the edge where it touches the unknown. That's why the path from novice to expert is so counterintuitive. Beginners often brim with confidence, unaware of how little they know. Experts, by contrast, may doubt themselves precisely because they see the vastness of what remains unknown. True mastery, then, isn't about certainty. It's about comfort with complexity, nuance, and limitation. Understanding the Dunning-Kruger effect gives us a powerful lens for self-reflection. It reminds us that growth starts with acknowledging our blind spots and embracing the discomfort of not knowing. It pushes us to balance confidence with humility and conviction with curiosity. And perhaps most importantly, it can help us view others with more compassion. When someone is overly confident, yet clearly misinformed, it's easy to write them off as arrogant. But often, they're simply caught in the very structure of how knowledge works. They don't know enough to know what they don't know. As physicist Richard Feynman once said, "A scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy." If one of the greatest scientific minds in history could admit that, then maybe the rest of us can take a step back too. That humility is the real takeaway of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Wisdom doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with recognizing the limits of our understanding. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about something, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, could I be standing on Mount Stupid? Because the first step to climbing the slope of enlightenment is realizing you haven't reached the summit yet.